Welcome, everyone. I'm Dan Murphy. I'm Executive Director of the Masavar Rahmani Center for Business and Government. And today's event is entitled Building Conflict Resilience, Tools for the Discomfort of Disagreement. And I couldn't think of a better topic for today's day and age, whether you look at issues at Harvard, in our personal lives, in our wider world. These skills of deep listening, navigating conflict, are absolutely essential, and it's something that I've noticed and worked to improve over both my professional and my personal life. And I think I've noticed those people who I admire as leaders are not those who avoid conflict, but rather those who deal with it productively today. And we have the perfect person to guide us through this in Bob Bordone. He's an author, a senior fellow at Harvard Law School, and a founder of the Cambridge Negotiation Institute. He also served for 2 decades as a faculty member at Harvard Law School, and he serves as the director of the Consensus Building Institute Professional Development Academy and as an adjunct professor at Georgetown University Law School. I won't go through his whole professional resume to give him ample time to talk and for your questions and answers, but I will say that he is the USA Today best-selling author of Conflict Resilience, Negotiating Disagreement Without Giving Up or Giving In. And if you wish to try to win a copy of this book, you can put your name on a piece of paper over there and put it in the bowl. And my sense is that Bob would be happy to talk to you after the event and sign those books. So please take a moment to do that. I also want to welcome everybody who's here online today for today's event. We're going to start off by Bob sharing his thoughts for perhaps 30, 35 minutes, and then we'll turn it over to Q&A from you. So have your questions and answers ready, or your questions ready, rather. And without further ado, join me in welcoming Bob Bordone. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Thanks, everyone, for being here. It's really exciting to be presenting here at the Kennedy School. I have a huge amount of information, probably way too much, to give you. So I'm going to get right into it and just give you a map of what I'm hoping to do here. So I'm hoping to kind of tell you what conflict resilience is, what I mean by that, because it is definitely intended to be, and in fact, distinct from conflict resolution. I want to talk a little bit about why I think is important. My experience is that some people do not need persuasion on this, but I definitely work with others who actually are very dubious about this idea. I'm going to say a few words about the how. It's not a workshop, but I feel like if we're saying that there's tools, I should give you some and then leave some time for questions. So I want to start by playing for you an excerpt of a podcast from this past summer. I'm a very big podcast listener because I have a golden retriever with whom I take 45-minute walks every day and get to listen to podcasts. And I was listening to one of my favorites, The Daily, back in August. And I heard this exchange between now Vice President Vance and, it was not an exchange between Vice President Vance, but it involved Vice President Vance. And it involved an exchange between him and a dear friend of his from law school, a trans person whose name was Sophia Nelson. So I want to just share a clip from that podcast with you as a way of getting started.
Sophia, can I ask you to read this email from J.D. Vance, starting with the date?
Okay. June 29th, 2016. Hey, Sophs. Here is an excerpt from my book. I send this to you not just to brag, but because I'm sure if you read it, you'll notice reference to an extremely progressive lesbian. I'm sure most readers will have no idea who it refers to, but you will. I recognize now that this may not accurately reflect how you think of yourself, and for that, I'm really sorry. I hope you're not offended. Love you, JD.
And can you read your reply to that email?
Hey, buddy. First of all, congratulations. Second, thank you for reaching out and being sweet. Third, it'd take a lot more to offend me than that. How do you think I survived growing up in a similar place as you, gasp, even going to public school as a half-Mexican, non-evangelical tomboy. While we see and care about many of the same problems, I know we often come to different conclusions about how to best address them. But what I value in you is your genuineness, curiosity, kindness, and desire to make a difference. And I consider you a great friend. Love, Sophia.
How does it make you feel to read those exchanges now?
This relationship we had of mutual respect across the political divide has completely vanished. And I think it's sad for me personally, but I think it's also sad for the country.
Why sad for you personally?
It's heartbreaking to see somebody you respected and cared about turn on you and your neighbors, especially in the context of knowing that's not who he was. And then that's disappointing to see anyone do, obviously.
Sophia, can I?
Okay. So I want to start with that because I think that exchange between the vice president and Sophia Nelson is what I mean by conflict resilience. And I think where we are in 2024 or 2025 is also the worry that I have, and in some sense, the inspiration for me in writing this book. So by conflict resilience, this is how it's different from conflict resolution rather. It's the capacity to sit with the discomfort of our disagreements. So to be present around those with whom we have fundamental differences, to listen with a generosity and openness, but also to speak one's experience with authenticity and grace, regardless of whether there is any resolution. And I was struck, my kind of project on this really began, first time I gave a talk on the topic was in 2018, but the first time I started to notice this, I would say it was around 2015 or so, teaching actually at Harvard Law School. And I was on the admissions committee at the time. And I knew from being on the admissions committee that we worked very, very hard to bring together a very diverse set of students to the law school. And when I say diverse, I mean in every conceivable way, including politically. But the nature of conversation in the classrooms had changed in a particular way. It had become more boring and more dull. And yet, when I met with students individually, I knew they had very different opinions. And it occurred to me that what was happening was that there was a sense that the price of speaking was going up and the perceived benefit of speaking was going down. And the ease with which you could not speak and just find your people was much easier, right? Because of social media and algorithms. If you said the wrong thing in the classroom, you could find yourself called out on some kind of anonymous blog. If you think the other side is so extreme that there's no point in talking across this, you're not going to solve any problems anyway, so who cares? Why bother? Moreover, if you talk across the other side and it's perceived as betrayal by your side, you're not going to do it. It was striking to me. So this is something that I started to notice and was deeply concerning as somebody who taught problem solving and conflict resolution and negotiation, because you cannot actually negotiate or problem solve or have a hard conversation if you cannot actually stand the discomfort of the disagreement. There's things you could do, but you can't do those things. It was very striking to me. Just about 2 months ago, I saw this front page article in the Harvard Crimson, and it said, most Harvard students do not feel comfortable sharing controversial opinions in class study finds. And I was struck by this for so many reasons, but there's something about the word comfortable. And I thought, the very nature of sharing something controversial should cause some discomfort. And what is wrong with that? Discomfort, we have to learn to be more uncomfortable with difference, because otherwise we're in big trouble. So anyway, I mean, this is a project that began several years ago. The book just came out in March, but it's really about developing this capacity to sit with the discomfort of disagreement, because we can't get anything done if we don't. The book opens with a quote from Frederick Douglass. This is from a speech he gave on August 3rd, 1857. And it says, "If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet depreciate agitation want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the oceans without the awful roar of its many waters." So I want to be clear, first of all, right? I am totally into problem solving, and there's a lot of advice for problem solving in the book. But the premise of the book is actually, we don't need to have problem solving as the thing we're aiming for in order to be conflict resilient. And I want to also just make this much closer to home, right? It's not just about like the big political issues of the day. Um, it matters for all sorts of difficult conversations that we have every day with boss and family and fellow students and partner and parents and clergy, et cetera. I wrote this book in partnership with a brain scientist at NYU, which was a rich experience for me because I learned a whole lot about brain science and about what is going on in our brain in that moment when we are experiencing conflict, right? And at the broadest kind of level, I'm just going to speed through these. At the broadest kind of level, right, there's kind of 5 ways in which we handle conflict, right? We want to fight, we want to flee, or we freeze, like we just don't know what to do, or we fawn. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. It's gonna be okay. Right? We try like worrying that we're like losing the relationship, right? Or we walk away, but we fester, and it like pops out in various passive aggressive ways, down the road, right? And just to be clear, right, our brains, um, they're highly like they develop this over a very long period of time as a way to protect us. If there's an existential threat, automatic responses like this can be very helpful. It's just the case that for most of our shared life together in family, in community, in co-housing, in our country, these 5 automatic responses are not so helpful. And in fact, if we keep doing them over and over, they get us into all sorts of really big trouble. And the really good news that I learned in working with my colleague is that the brain has a neuroplasticity to it, meaning we can actually retrain our brain. Like we could rewire what happens, but it takes some effort. So my argument is that you cannot do consensus building or negotiation or have a difficult conversation or have a dialogue or solve a problem if you are not conflict resilient. Because if you cannot sit in the heat of the kitchen, then you cannot cook any meals. You cannot get anything done. So it really is prerequisite. So what does it get us? What are some of the benefits? Again, I'm going to start with the things that aren't even around solutions. Like when we are conflict resilient across a divide, our empathy for others grows, and the likelihood that we demonize and dehumanize goes down. And that helps build an ability to coexist peacefully, right? Which is kind of the exact opposite thing we see going on, I would argue, right now in our country. And frankly, sometimes in our families. So yeah, I did mention I watch podcasts. I listen to podcasts a lot. This one is very recent, less than 2 months ago. I was listening to an episode of This American Life. And I want to play a clip here because it is a very hard one to listen to, and some of you might find it to be very sad. And yet I think there's something very special in it as well. So this is was an episode produced by a reporter. His name is Zach Mack. Over the past few years, his father has become more and more of a conspiracy theorist. And this has deeply affected the entire family's relationship. It turns out Zach never had a particularly close relationship with his dad. He always felt some distance. And at the start of 2024, he and his dad made a $10,000 bet. And the bet was that the dad said the following 10 things would happen by the end of 2024. And the son said they would not. If they happened, the son owed $10,000, otherwise the other way. As part of this, the son made a commitment that he was going to engage his father in conversation around this over the course of the year. So here are the 10 things. Barack Obama will be convicted of treason. Joe Biden will be convicted of treason. Nancy Pelosi will be convicted of treason. Bill Clinton will be convicted of treason. Hillary Clinton will be convicted of treason. Donald Trump will be reinstated without an election. Joe Biden will be removed from office. Kathy Hochul, the governor of New York, will be removed from office. Eric Adams, the mayor of New York, will be removed from office. The United States will come under martial law. Those are the 10 things by the end of the calendar year. Just update, none of these things happened in 2024, it turns out. And dad agrees, none of them happened. So dad owes the $10,000. He does say, the dad says, none of them happened, but they all are going to happen. I was just wrong about the time frame. So to be clear, the dad does not move off the mark about these things. I want to play for you this last piece of this podcast where Zach is talking to his dad as they're kind of wrapping up the kind of right before the payment of the $10,000. So I think it's very powerful.
As the conversation wound down, I let go of any notion that I could convince him of anything. I was finally ready to stop struggling and just accept the truth. I couldn't help him. I just want to say I do really appreciate... Oh, man, sorry. It's been a hard year, man. Yeah. I mean, I appreciate the conversations we've had all year. Like, I do feel, I don't know, I feel closer to you than I ever have, and I'm really sad about the state of this family.
Yeah.
But I do appreciate your openness, your willingness to, you never ducked a hard question.
No need to.
We made the bet a year ago, but I've waited a lot longer than that to have this conversation with him. All right, let's get a hug.
Oh, I love you. I love you too.
As we stood there hugging, I just broke down.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. It's...
That may not feel like a good outcome. But what's interesting is that they are still connected. And if you listen to the whole episode, and maybe you got a little glimpse of this, right? He has always felt disconnected from his father. By the way, during the course of the year, mom files for divorce, and sister says, I'm not coming home for the holidays. Not problem solving. Oh, and by the way, because first time I shared this, someone said, well, did the son take the $10,000? He did. He took the $10,000, right? They don't agree. They don't, were you wondering that? Yeah, they don't agree, right? Now, I will say, right, sometimes all of this does increase, that is, the resilience increases our capacity for problem solving or for doing things we didn't think possible. I'm going to share an old story from the late 1980s, when a guy by the name of Dr. Anthony Fauci was, some of us know who he is, but he was working on an earlier global health crisis, that is HIV/AIDS, during the Reagan administration, an administration that was not so into research to address the AIDS epidemic. Despite Fauci's devotion to this, there were a lot of people in the LGBT community who were dissatisfied with the efforts that Fauci was having. And there was a group called ACT UP, led by a guy by the name of Larry Kramer, who was so dissatisfied This may not seem that scandalous to you, but in the San Francisco Examiner, on a particular morning, he writes an op-ed where he calls Fauci a murderer. Maybe that's nowadays it's not that scandalous, but he calls him an incompetent idiot and a murderer. I'm going to play with you a clip of how Fauci reacts to this in a national newspaper.
We have to go back 2 years to 1988, to that letter that Larry Kramer wrote to Fauci where he called him a murderer. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
The whole murderer thing?
Of course, of course.
When Dr. Fauci saw that letter, he thought,
If somebody is that angry to be able to print that in a national newspaper, I mean, I got to find out what is it that has stimulated him to do that.
so he just called this guy who called him a murderer, called him on the phone and said, let's figure this out.
So what that leads to is a series of weekly Friday night dinners of members of ACT UP at Fauci's house over an extended period of time. They have major disagreements. In fact, so much so that they continue to at one point burn his image and effigy on the NIH lawn. But despite this, the conversations fundamentally change the research protocols, who is brought in for clinical trials, how they think about the clinical trials, right? And the capacity to sit with that disagreement, right? I think it probably explains a lot of why Fauci was able to do similar kinds of things during COVID as part of the Trump administration. So I just want to say this, when I think about conflict resilience, we are not saying all the time, every single second. But if you can't develop that ability to sit with the discomfort of your disagreements with people who matter to you, even when solutions don't seem likely, there's a lot at risk and a lot lost. So let's talk a little bit about the how of this. I just want to ask folks to get into their mind one difficult conversation that you need to have and that you have been avoiding. So just do that now. I'm not going to ask you to share what the conversation is, but I do want you to get one into your mind. Could be personal or professional. One difficult conversation in your life that you have been avoiding. Then I'm going to ask this, I will ask a few of you to share. Just what are one or two fears you have about having the conversation? And you don't need to share the conversation, just the fear. Yeah, please. Yeah, I might get rejected. What else? I'll be misunderstood. For these short ones, I'll just repeat it, Claire. Thanks. Yeah. And if there's any in the chat you want to read, feel free to. Others, yeah.
Well, in my case, it's with my son.
Yeah.
And the concern is that he stops talking to me.
I'll lose the relationship or he'll stop talking to me altogether. It'll get worse. It'll get worse. Yeah. Good. So I'm going to ask you to think of the same exact conversation, but just give you 15 or 20 seconds to think about what are the costs of not having the conversation, the cost of avoiding the conversation. I'll just give you a few seconds to think about that. Okay. Well, a few of you share a cost of avoiding. Yes. I'll lose the relationship anyway. Yeah. What else? Yeah, sleepless nights. It's taking up a lot of my headspace, right? What else? Problem doesn't get any better or maybe even gets worse. Yeah, great. So part of the reason, and I'm sure there's many of these, right, is, and this is, I think in our book, listen, I hope all of you run out if you don't win the book. I hope you go buy the book. I'll happily sign it for you, right? And I think it will help you a lot with your hard conversations. But here's the tough part. The first 4 chapters of the book are all about ourselves. It's all about the internal. Because so many times, right, I think what keeps us stuck is our own internal voice. We feel bad about something, but then we're like, it's going to go badly. I'm going to lose the relationship anyway, so I better not say anything, but I still feel bad. And we actually have all these internal conflicts. Reasons why I should raise something, reasons why it's not worth it. Reasons why maybe I'm not so sure and I'll be wrong, but reasons why I think I actually do have something worth saying. And here's what's interesting about these different sides. We often don't treat them neutrally. We kind of code them. Saying nothing is being nice and generous, or saying nothing is the safe route. Um, um, maybe asserting something that's important to me is selfish or negative, or maybe it's emotional and therefore it doesn't matter. Um, and a lot of the work of being able to be conflict resilient is actually a lot of self-work. And a lot of what's been really interesting to me is both the brain science and also work in internal family systems that kind of really informs a lot of the beginning of the book. And for me, kind of completes a puzzle as somebody who was teaching a lot of these skills in a profession, at the law school, but I also had a lot of Kennedy School people in the class, right? You could teach people the skills, but if they're not doing this internal work, they're unlikely to produce them. And so the goal here isn't to silence one side of yourself or evaluate one side of yourself, but it's to integrate. Actually, all these sides of yourself have something worth saying. And it's important to make sure in a hard conversation, you are giving voice to all of them. It's also part of the opening. There's something I'm hoping to talk about, and it's making me nervous and anxious. I'm worried that it might hurt our relationship. At the same time, it feels very important. And I feel like if I don't do this, there's a chance our relationship might also not last. And I wonder whether that's something we could try out together. That's like the opening. Then once you're in there, right, there's skill sets that matter. And I mean, one could go on long periods of time on all these. I'm gonna probably have to fly through them quickly. But broadly, right, deep listening, effective assertion, and mindful awareness. So just on the listening piece, I think oftentimes we have pretty limiting assumptions about the role of listening. We say it's something for a weak person, and I'm not being persuasive, and if I listen too long, they'll think I agree with them. And of course, if that's what you think of listening, you are not going to spend a lot of time listening. I think it's much more helpful to say the more I am open to learning, I'll learn useful information from them. The other thing we know, right, is that even if I know everything, right, I don't need to listen to my dad who's a conspiracy theorist. I know what these people say. I'm not going to learn anything about you. He's not going to persuade me that Hillary Clinton is going to be convicted of treason in the next 12 months. What we know is that actually people just have an independent interest in being understood. So some of the research that my co-author has done has shown that people who have a good listener in their life, their brain health is 4 years younger than people who don't. Isn't that amazing? It's like, it's worth paying someone to be a good listener. 4 years of health. There's also just a tranche of research that just around the reciprocity principle, right? If you listen well, someone will reciprocate it. So broadly speaking, though, I want to suggest that there's kind of two things we need to do to be a good deep listener, as opposed to somebody who's just sitting there nodding their head and quiet, being quiet. There's some internal work, and then there's the behaviors. But the internal work is really the harder piece, right? How can you negotiate yourself to a place of curiosity? And you don't have to be curious about how they came to the view. I mean, if you are, or what the view is, but you have to be curious about something. If you can't be curious about anything, then it will be hard to do any behaviors that don't look like you took a course at the Harvard Kennedy School. You will not look authentic. So the hard work is, how do I get myself into something curious? Again, maybe it is just how they came to have this viewpoint. Or maybe you're curious about how they react to others who disagree. Or how they experience, maybe the curiosity is not even about the thing, but about, are you curious about how they experience the bad conversations you've had in the past? You have to find something to be curious about. And then, of course, you have to do the actions of listening. So by deep listening, we don't mean things like grunts and ahams, like, oh, I mean, nothing wrong with that, right? But that's just not what we mean by deep listening. Sitting there quietly, not deep listening. So all of you are hopefully like paying attention, but none of you are deep listening to me because you can't just sit there quietly and deep listen. Saying things like I understand or I totally understand where you're coming from, not only is not deep listening, two British researchers, Rackham and Carlisle, have shown this to be one of the top 5 irritators. Oh, I totally understand where you're coming from. It's real irritating. It's like, how, like, I've talked for 30 seconds. How can you totally understand? It almost is like, are you done yet? So I could start talking. And here's another one, some version of okay, but. Like, you make some really good points there, but. A few years ago, I had been on, I would say, 6 or 7 dates with this person that I thought was going pretty well. And then I got this text. This is the actual text, by the way, because I had a purposes to something positive. The text said, I enjoy chatting with you. The intellectual stimulation is phenomenal. I respect you too much to not share this as soon as I know it. But you and I are a friend match, not a dating match. I gotta tell you, I didn't go home to my best friend or my roommate or my family and say, you know, the one thing I'll always cherish is they thought the intellectual stimulation was phenomenal. No, I'm sorry. Everything after the but is what I paid attention to. And that is like that, right? In real relationships. I mean, one good thing came from this because I've literally had been teaching this for a long time. And then I was like, oh my gosh, this text is just perfect because it just shows you how but is a great eraser, right? Everything before the but is like, no. So the behaviors that, if you take a negotiation class here with Brian Mandel or Hannah Riley Bowles or whoever else you might take the class with, right? You'll probably learn some behaviors. I'm not going to go too deep into these. I think the thing I want to stress, the important piece of it, is that you have to be curious first. But paraphrasing, right, is restarting what you heard the other person say without agreeing. Inquiry is kind of open-ended questions. That is, questions that don't end with a yes or no or either or. And acknowledging emotion is really trying to acknowledge and reflect back the feelings that you hear. Again, regardless of whether you think a normal person would have those feelings or they deserve to have those feelings or you would have those feelings, just really reflecting them back. So you paraphrase when people speak in chapters and books instead of sentences and paragraphs. So when people start looping and they get redundant, a really good deep listener actually interrupts. It says, you know, I think you've said a lot. Let me just make sure. I've heard 5 themes. Inquiry, right, is something you do. This is really hard. At the moment when you want to say, I disagree, or you are wrong, that is the moment to do an inquiry. Say more about, help me understand, elaborate, please. One thing you want to be careful about is something called hot inquiry. So what is hot inquiry? Hot inquiry is something that is a question, insofar there's a question mark at the end, but it's actually an argument. It's not a question. Like, but wouldn't you agree, or isn't it? That's actually not an inviting question. It's more like a fight with a question mark. I don't know if any of you know Krista Tippett. Any Krista Tippett fans here? Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, good. Oh yes, I can. Yeah. I don't mind sharing the PDF of these, by the way, if it's helpful. So Krista Tippett, a few years ago, that's probably not more than a few years ago, it's maybe 7 or 8 years ago. So she for many years has had a program on NPR called On Being, and we invited her to speak at a conference at the law school on political polarization. And during her talk, she had 2 quotes that I thought were really powerful when it came to conflict resilience and inquiry. One was, questions elicit answers in their likeness, and it's hard to resist a generous question. And my experience when I teach conflict resolution, when I mediate, is that this is really true. That when a question is open and generous and curious, it elicits a kind and fulsome answer. And when a question is sparky and short, it elicits a fight. And so as much as you can do that. And then this last piece, right, acknowledging emotion, which is really, again, trying to reflect the emotion back. I think a lot of times when we're in a really difficult conversation, and particularly, I mean, I can't speak for Harvard Kennedy School students, nor can I really speak for Harvard Law School students, but I've worked with them enough that I'll try, right? But you know, we're like very smart. We quickly see, sometimes quicker than other people, the 3 things you could do that would be really helpful right now if you just were planful, rational, and wise, right? And so I'm just going to tell you what that is, right? And it doesn't work. And the problem is that the other person isn't ready for it yet. Right? They need this acknowledged emotion piece, which, to be clear, is not agreeing that's a right emotion. It's not trying to be condescending. It's just seeing them, right? It's just seeing them that then opens up the space to move forward. Some time ago, I saw this cartoon in the New Yorker that just spoke to me on this, right? I'll read it to you. It says, "Ah, I see you're trying to vent. May I offer you some annoyingly pragmatic solutions?" And as you can imagine, that gentleman is soon going to have a bowl of spaghetti in his face, right? Okay, so let's just talk a little bit about assertion. Um, so broadly, right, we can imagine assertion. Assertion's really important here. I think too frequently, people who teach conflict resolution have only spoken about listening and not about speaking. Um, but both really matter. And you know, assertion can be on a continuum from complete submission, like whatever you say, oh my gosh, I don't want to upset you, to my way or the highway, right? Take it or leave it. And there are times when I want to make sure I'm just being clear here, right? We're not saying you never would do these. I mean, if you're going out with friends tonight and you don't really care what kind of food you eat and everyone else wants Indian, all right, like submission sounds great. Like, we'll have Indian, it's fine, right? Maybe if you're like in a souk somewhere haggling for something and there's no reputation and there's no relationship, maybe you could say, you know, not a penny over $3. Most of life is actually not that, it turns out, because we have to work with each other. Like, and these have really bad consequences, right? Because submission reinforces bad behavior. It could lead to relational exit. And yes, my little dirty tactic has worked because you're all looking at that adorable dog, which is exactly what I wanted at this phase. But this is an example of what happens when submission is your way of handling the situation. Because those 2 people there are my parents. And you could see that my golden retriever, Rosie, is just about ready to eat that entire birthday cake. And she will sit there the whole meal. And my mother's like, why does she do that? She doesn't do that with you. I'll tell you why. You feed the dog. She knows she's going to get something. So you're reinforcing the bad behavior, right? Again, you know, aggression increases escalation, ruins relationships, and also leads to exit. So just as a starting point for assertion, I want to suggest, and this is, yes, the same exact slide for listening. We need to move from a place of certainty to curiosity. So I want to do a little exercise here. How am I doing on time? Yeah, okay. I want to do a little exercise here. So for this exercise, I'm going to ask you, you could do this if you're on Zoom too, but for everyone in the room, I'm going to ask you to raise your hand, and you need to do that now. You need to raise your hand, and you need to keep it up in the air. And I'm going to ask you to count the number of times the letter F, as in Frank, appears on this screen, not including the conflict resilience thing down here. Okay, F as in Frank. When you are 90% sure you have counted accurately, you can put your hand down. That will be my indication that you are done counting the letter F. When you're 90% sure, just put your hand down. Okay, I'll give you another 10 seconds or so. Three more hands. Okay, just in the interest of time, I'm going to stop. Again, you could do this both if you're watching on YouTube or in the room. I'm going to ask you to take out a smartphone and scan that QR code. Yes, you should have a question popping up that asks you, how many times did you count the letter F? How many times did you count the letter F? Is it popping up? Please tell me. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Good. So, yeah. Great. Okay. Good. So just put in your answer and submit it. I'll wait another 10 or 12 seconds here. Okay. Most people voted. Let's take a little look here. Okay. Wow. Oh, whatever else could be said about the amazing people at the Kennedy School, no one could deny that you have recruited an incredibly diverse set of counters. Congratulations. Congratulations. Really, really good. It looks like 11 is definitely the winner here, for sure. Now, I'm going to ask you, in a moment, you're going to see one more question coming up on Mentimeter. So I'm going to ask you to go back to Mentimeter, and please answer this question accurately, which is, I'll keep it up here just in case you need the QR code. Are you still reasonably certain you counted accurately, yes or no? And no shame, and this is completely anonymous, but are you still reasonably certain you counted accurately, yes or no? Okay, let's take a look at the answers. Okay, wow, we have a certain group here. 19 of you are like, yeah, I'm still pretty darn sure I'm right. Only 6 of you said no. This would be a landslide election, right? For sure. Polls would be, at 9 o'clock. We'd call it for whoever won. Here's the bad news. Only 2 of you were right. Yeah, because there were actually 16 Fs there. Want to see them? What? Want to see them? Top line 1, 2. Next line 3, 4. Next line 5. Then 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. 16 Fs. Why did I do this exercise, right? This exercise is so unlike most conflicts, because most conflicts, the thing we're fighting about, it's hardly ever the case that everybody involved was there for 100% of it. Usually we're there for some of it, but not all of it. It's also hardly ever the case that the thing we're fighting about is as objectively true as counting the letter F. But most of us go into that with the idea that I'm right and you're wrong, and my purpose is to show you. And I just want to say that is a perilous way to begin any kind of difficult conversation. And it's because, I'm just going to skip over these for the interest of time, it's because we are subject to partisan perceptions. So when I'm assertive, I want to start with listening, first of all, so I can tie what I'm saying back to what's important to them. But then I want to use this tool called the ladder of inference. And the idea of this ladder is that in the real world, there are oceans of available data, and we don't have access to all of it. If I said to you, are you enjoying life at the Harvard Kennedy School? What I know is that whether you said, this is the most amazing place, I want to be here till forever and ever, or I can hardly wait to graduation, it's a pit, right? I know it's not based on 100% shared data. Yeah, you've all elected to be here with me today, right? But then you have different pieces of data. I don't know what you are selecting to then put through some kind of reasoning process to come up with a conclusion. And so when we're asserting, what we really need to be doing is working each other's ladders. Here's my tentative conclusion. Here's what I've observed in the universe. Here's the story I tell about it. And what about you? Now, sometimes that will shift views, and sometimes it will not shift views. But it's a much more productive conversation. 2 more things I want to say about this. Just avoiding globalizations. Anytime you say you never, you always, you get into trouble, right? You never bring out the garbage. Oh, yes, in the leap year, on a full moon. I brought it out, right? And speaking from your own perspective. Things you could be certain about is how you're feeling. Things you can't be so certain about is what their motivation is. Okay, last piece, and then I want to just have at least a few minutes for questions, is just mindful awareness. So there's a big piece in our book about again, what's going on in our brain. So this is a slide that I did run by my brain scientist, neurologist colleague. He said it was acceptable. Right, but at the most basic level, our brain is operating at two levels. There's this conscious level that's making these decisions, and then there's a hidden mind that is less aware of the decisions we're making. And when we're kind of operating in a good place, we're making really good analytic decisions. But when the other person suddenly does something that is upsetting or triggering, it actually releases a bunch of actual chemicals in our brain, like adrenaline and cortisol. And these chemicals overload the frontal lobe, which is the more rational part of our brain, and our amygdala, the emotional center, takes over. And that could last for like 5 to 20 minutes. And if they keep on doing annoying things, it keeps on getting extended. And so what's happening is we have this limbic irritability that is causing physical reactions that then is changing how we're thinking about the situation and affecting our behaviors. So the key here around the emotional refractory period is simply to do no harm. That's the most important thing. And there's an incredible amount of research about the power of taking a pause. And that pause can literally be like 10 or 15 seconds, or it might be longer. You might need a break. Matt Lieberman, who's at UCLA, has done this really interesting research where he looks at the fMRA of human brains that are kind of in an angry mode. And what his research has shown is if a person names the feelings to themselves, like I'm feeling angry, upset, and frustrated right now, it reduces the amount of time it takes for the brain to move from the amygdala control to the frontal lobe. So he calls this affective labeling, or name it to tame it. As a more ongoing practice, there's this incredibly interesting research around a particular, and it's this particular kind of breath move called cyclic sighing, which if you just do 5 minutes daily, it will reduce your anxiety and improve your ability to respond purposefully in the face of stress and conflict. So what it really is just taking in a breath, then topping up, and then slow exhale. 5 minutes of that daily actually changes your body's ability your brain's ability to respond to conflict. So let me pause here. And I don't know, what do we have, like 10 minutes, 12 minutes? 10 minutes of questions? 10 minutes of questions. And I think we'll wait for the microphone to come around if you ask the question here. There must be some question. Emily.
Thanks, Bob. This is super interesting. So kind of going back to the very beginning with conflict resilience and the clips that you let us listen to that were very powerful. And I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about like the longevity of that, because it's one thing to say like in that moment where with the dad and the son, he was hugging his dad, and we can kind of see that there was resilience there, and
yeah.
But what does that mean for the next 20 years of his life with his father? And not that there's an answer for that, but just like thinking about like, it's one thing to do it in a mediation and a negotiation where you're doing one specific thing, but what does it mean, like those long relationships, and how do we continue to work that muscle of the conflict resilience when we need it over and over and over again?
Yeah, such a good question. To which I'll probably give a slightly dissatisfying answer, but like some version of it depends. But a number of things I would say, and kind of things we discussed in the book, which really were not in this presentation. Because the whole last part of our book is how do you decide when to stay and when to go? And even that question, I think, is nuanced, which is, so for example, we don't know what's going to happen, obviously, with this American Life episode, but at some level, there's a number of questions. There's do I want to continue to engage my dad on this set of issues? And we don't really know what's going to happen in the next 20 years, but you get the sense that from the clip even I showed, the answer is no. I realized I couldn't do anything. Then there's the question of, or maybe I do, maybe I still want to continue to engage on this, right? Then there's a question of, do I stay in relationship with? And what are the terms of that? And we don't know what's going to happen here again. But there are diagnostic questions around that. Like one is, well, what is the alternative? Another, though, would be, and this is something we hopefully handle with a lot of care, which is trying to distinguish discomfort from harm and discomfort from trauma. So like the thrust of this book is that we need to increase our willingness and ability to sit with discomfort, but I don't want it to be misheard as, well, must, continued abuse, right? Continued harm or trauma. So, so there's that piece, right? And then of course, even exit is complicated. If it's a friendship, you probably can exit it. If it's a work situation, you might not be able to exit it tomorrow morning, but you could certainly update your CV and get going. And if it's your father, I mean, you can semi-exit, but you can't, like at some point there's going to be a reckoning, right? Even if the reckoning is the estate at the end. So I think part of that is thinking about what that might look like. And one of the things I would just say that we talk about, and this is just another brain science contribution, is I would just say that an observation that I have had is that partially for social media, partially because I think of our just patience and bandwidth, we don't see the upside of staying engaged. And if we don't see that, we're not going to do the work. And so the contribution, it's actually work by this guy, Jed Brewer, is trying to understand what is the BBO, the bigger, better offer, right? If our brain doesn't see a bigger, better offer at the other side of the work, then we're not going to do the work. And I think part of this, right, is taking the pause, understanding short and longer term interests, understanding concepts. So some of this, right, draws from negotiation literature. And what feels really good in that moment, because of the way our brains are trained to like run away or avoid it, has pretty high down the road costs and or there's some upsides. But we don't know, right? And I think actually the last thing I was saying this, Emily, is I think one of the reasons why people, one of the excuses that people give for not engaging conflict is it's not going to make a difference or it's not going to get better. And that might actually be true. And often I think it's an excuse. I mean, one of the most funny thing I always experience is like, I'm sitting there with some like CEO who's like paying me a non-trivial amount of hourly money. And they'll say something like, well, but I don't think this is really that important. Or like, that doesn't matter. I'm like, okay. So you're spending me, like you're paying me several $100s to sit with you right now on something that doesn't matter. I just want to make sure I understand. Like, oh, well, I guess, yeah, like I don't buy it, right? If it didn't matter, we wouldn't be sitting here right now. Now we need to figure out what to do. So I don't know if that's totally responsive to your question. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah. Well, maybe are there any in the chat or no? Yeah. Okay. Let's take this one. Maybe if we have time, we'll take one from the chat. No, we won't.
Okay. I don't want to be rude, but of course I will be.
No.
A number of managers are reading your book.
Yeah.
Library managers. And the one area that drives me crazy is I wish you would have hired David Mamet to write your dialogue. Because if someone came at me with your preferred dialogue, I would say, what are you talking about? Shut up, get to the point. I mean, is it really a matter of linguistic changes? But I think, especially we're up to the third chapter, so it's brutal. I really think it's not a matter of linguistic changes.
Yeah. So say more about why you don't think it's linguistic changes.
Well, because if you run around saying things like "be authentic," you can't read a script.
Yeah.
And you can't have a set group of language that, oh, I'm feeling this, I'm feeling that about how I'm going to ask you about all that kind of stuff is not necessarily authentic. It may be authentic for some, but not for others.
Yeah. Okay, that's helpful. So I think, if it's okay, I think I want to like concur with you in part and dissent with you in part. I think the part I want to concur with is that you have to find language that works for you. And, you know, we're putting stuff in there that, you know, would work for us, right? And I think that, and I think if you're just going off of a script, you're going to be in big trouble. So I think I agree with that. And I think there's a risk to putting script in the book because people will think this is how you're supposed to do it, which was not what we mean. Although there's a reason why we put the script in the book, because some people will be like, well, what would it look like if I have no idea? I think that, I don't know if this is actually dissenting with you or not, but I do think that there's a stance shift that has to happen. So when we say be authentic, what I think what we're meaning is speaking the difference, finding ways to give voice to sides that you haven't given voice to yet. Does that make sense? But the how you do it, I think, might vary. But I think what we're meaning is that there are times when people silence certain sides of themselves and in service of the relationship. But I think it's disserving the relationship and it's less than authentic. Is that helpful?
Yes.
Yeah.
One of the things that I did to overcome that
Yeah.
was I just rewrote all.
Oh, wow. Oh my gosh, I'd love to see them. I mean, if you're willing to share. Yeah, no, yeah, no, I think this is, I mean, that's very, I mean, first of all, I love that. It's really super helpful feedback because there is a tension. And I also like, even sometimes, I mean, sometimes someone will be, you know, when I think about teaching, they're like using some language I gave them and like, this is not going to work for you, but because it's just not who you are. But you need to figure out like, how do you shift your stance and then find your language that works for that. I think that does have to happen. That's a great question, though.
We have time for one more. I think there's one online. If you don't mind, we're gonna get one question from online, if that's okay.
Yeah, and I'll be brief in the answer.
How do we build cultures of accountability and conflict resilience that don't rely on marginalized people to constantly educate or hold others, especially when some of those beliefs might directly target their own identities and lived experiences?
Yeah, really great question. So we try to address this a bit in the book, maybe not to full satisfaction, but because I think part of this is it goes back a little bit to Emily's question, which is, in my mind, you are always needing to make a decision about whether to engage in relation to what you would do if you didn't engage. And what's available to you if you didn't engage. This is probably not going to be a satisfying answer. But my answer is, if we are waiting for power to be equalized and justice to arrive before we engage across lines of difference, then we will not do that. We'll never get there, which does mean, I think, that there are extra burdens on marginalized individuals and peoples to do more exhausting, hard work. Now, that does not mean that as someone who may be in that category, that it is your individual duty or responsibility to do that every single time it comes up. Because it isn't. Sometimes you need to actually decide to step away. But I don't think I have a really good answer to the question, because I think it is a fact of a lack of justice in our world right now. And the thing that I do not think is that it is not brave or courageous for people who decide to, from marginalized communities, to do that work is an act of like great bravery and courage, not an act of accommodation, which I think sometimes it gets seen as somehow an act of accommodation. So I hope that's satisfactory.
Bob, thank you very much. I know I'm going back to my desk to send some emails with a little bit different language in them after this presentation, I'll be very honest, but please join me in thanking Bob Bordone for the wonderful presentation.